Hello everybody, my name is Louis Keane and I'm a master's student at Charles University studying international relations. I'd like to welcome you to my podcast on the politics of nuclear non-proliferation. Today's topic is the nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine and its effect on the nuclear global order. This episode will feature a very special guest, Dr. Stephen Herzog, who's kindly agreed to let me conduct an interview with him. In this interview, we'll be able to explore this topic through a specialist's lens. But before that, I would like to set the stage a little bit, explain some of the key concepts and ideas of this topic so that everyone is clear, and even those that don't know too much about this topic can still enjoy and learn something from the video. Now, there's no doubt that everyone watching today is familiar with the ongoing war in Ukraine and the devastation that has occurred over the last year. Likewise, I think most of you are probably very aware of the nuclear aspect of this war, whether that be the elevated threat and concern of nuclear use, the aggressive rhetoric from the Kremlin, or perhaps even the attacks on nuclear power plants across Ukraine. In relation to these phenomena, the key question we would like to ask today is what impact has this war had on the nuclear global order? And in more understandable terms, for those of you that maybe aren't very familiar with these concepts, how does this war impact the international system that governs nuclear weapons, and how is our safety affected? So let's start out by defining what the nuclear global order actually is. The term is quite self-explanatory, but in its simplest terms, the nuclear global order is an international system which maintains order and safety with regards to nuclear weapons. These include national and international norms, practices, values, policies, rules, and institutions which regulate the use and acquisition of nuclear weapons. With this in mind, we can explore exactly how this order maintains itself, which is through two distinct but interlinked systems, which we call restraint and deterrence. The system of deterrence is quite straightforward, and I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with it, perhaps with terms such as MAD, mutually assured destruction. But deterrence is based on the idea that as long as there is more than one nuclear-armed nation, nuclear weapons will not be used in fear of retaliation from the other nation. Of course, there are some holes to this theory. As nations, perhaps without nuclear weapons or without allies to help them with deterrence, they can be bullied, and I think that can be seen in Ukraine at the moment. In this system, the weapons are both the threat and the solution to total annihilation, really. The system of restraint outlines that the use of nuclear weapons is bad, very bad. It asserts that the proliferation, acquisition, and possession of nuclear weapons poses an existential threat to humanity, and therefore they should be controlled and eventually eliminated through disarmament. The most well-known example of this is the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, which currently 190 countries are party to. This treaty aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology, to promote the cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament. An important tenet under this system is nuclear arms control, wherein international institutions and norms emerge which place restrictions and regulations on the production, proliferation, and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. This could take place through bilateral checks, such as the arrangement held by the US and Russia under the START I and II treaties, or as a result of inspections from international agencies, such as the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission. The war in Ukraine has come as a real shock, as it demonstrated that the post-war European order for peace wasn't as strong as perhaps we originally expected. Now, we want to determine whether this is the same for the nuclear global order, and to what extent that this order may be affected. Now, this isn't to suggest that the nuclear global order wasn't in any trouble before this war either. Trump withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a treaty which banned the use of certain missiles between the US and Russia in 2018 after citing Russian violations. And even besides arms control, the general rhetoric and attitude towards nuclear weapons was less than healthy. And we can see this from not only Putin's threats in the lead up to and during the war, but even from the interesting type of nuclear brinkmanship between Trump and Kim Jong-un. The new START treaty is the only nuclear arms control treaty that ensures a cap on nuclear arsenals between the US and Russia at the moment. And this is especially potent because the US and Russia account for, I think, upwards of 90% of the global nuclear arsenal. And this treaty is set to expire in 2026, and it doesn't look like further negotiations are likely to take place at the moment due to the war. So how dangerous is this war for the global order? What is the likelihood for the use of nuclear weapons? Is arms control and non-proliferation in danger? What can we expect to see in the coming months and years? To help us answer some of these difficult questions, Dr. Stephen Herzog will be joining us. I'd also like to note that along with his colleague Dr. Bolfras, Dr. Herzog has authored an excellent article titled "The War in Ukraine and the Nuclear Global Order," which is definitely worth a read after this because it goes into depth into some of the areas we did not have time to cover today. And even on the areas we did have time to cover, it really gives a great outline of the more complex concepts that we talk about. So without further ado, I'd like to cut to that part of the podcast, and I really hope you enjoyed the interview because I think Dr. Herzog gives some really good answers, very informative as well. So I hope you enjoy. So hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the podcast. This section is going to be our interview with a very special guest, Dr. Stephen Herzog. I'm just going to read a little bit about him from the About section from the Center for Security Studies in Zurich. Dr. Herzog is a senior researcher in nuclear arms control at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. He's an academic co-chair of Beyond Nuclear Deterrence, and which is an initiative of the MacArthur Foundation, and he's also part of Harvard University's project on managing the atom. I thought something very interesting for my fellow students is the degrees which he studied, because they're very varied. He holds a PhD in political science from Yale, a master's in security studies from Georgetown University, and a bachelor's in international relations from Knox College, which are things that we all study. And so thank you very much for coming today. And I hope I got all of that right.
No, it's all right, and I'm delighted to be here, Louis.
Perfect. So as you all know, we're going to be discussing the nuclear aspect of the war in Ukraine and its impact or impacts on the global nuclear order. So first question I'd like to ask you is just a bit of a fun question. Do you think since the outbreak of the war last year, nuclear weapons being deployed or nuclear war is more likely? And if so, do you think you could put like a percentage on it?
So I think absolutely that the risk of nuclear war is most certainly elevated as compared to last year. And it's very difficult, though, to see what's happening because sometimes Putin makes very ambiguous or sometimes a little bit clearer nuclear threats. And sometimes, as Putin did in early December, he came forward and said that Russia will most certainly not use its nuclear weapons first. But I think that everything that we've seen with Russian nuclear threats and consistent behavior and Putin promising retaliation and trying to keep NATO out of Ukraine does indicate that the threat of nuclear war, I believe, is much higher in 2023 and 2022 than we've seen in years past. I also think that the threat of nuclear war has perhaps risen in some ways when the Russian Federation carried out these sham referendums in parts of Ukraine, essentially claiming that these territories in Ukraine were part of the Russian Federation's national territory, which would then put them within the protection of Russia's nuclear weapons. I get asked this question a lot, and I think that a lot of nuclear experts do, about how likely is it that we will see the risk of nuclear war as a result of Ukraine or Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And it's a tough question. And, fortunately, I think there would be things that we would see in advance if Putin were going to use nuclear weapons. We would see movement of nuclear weapons being reported by intelligence agencies or open source intelligence analysts. We'd probably see leaks coming from dissenters in the Russian military on Telegram channels, as we've seen about past things. But when people give numbers when it relates to putting a percentage on the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine or associated with Ukraine, I kind of call this the scaring people's grandma effect almost. And that is that the public, right, reads a lot about these things and thinks into them. And so one of the things I did a few weeks ago, I was curious, is I had a call with about 15 colleagues who are nuclear weapons experts, and I asked them the same question just because I was curious. I said, let's peg a percentage on this. And the numbers I got are from far less than 1% to upwards of 20%. And if you think about mathematical and statistical odds, that is a massive, massive range. So even nuclear experts have a lot of disagreement over them. And I've also done polling of the public to see what does the public think that the risk of nuclear use in Ukraine will be. And on average, if you poll together results among Americans in the United States, because that's the only place I've asked the question, it's about 35% is about the percentage that the public in the United States is polling at. So what I would say, just to circle around, is the risk of nuclear use is rising. I think it's difficult to put a percentage on it. And I think it's also important for experts to try and not scaremonger to the public. While I think that the risk of nuclear use is rising, I still put it as quite low. And so when I think about all the different things that are happening in Ukraine, grievous violation of human rights, violations of the international laws of war, mass casualties, the refugee crisis, as much as I personally care about nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear use or nuclear war in Ukraine is not the thing that bothers me the most about the conflict, and it's not what keeps me up at night, even though I think the risk is elevated.
Okay, so would you also then view perhaps Putin's war in Ukraine as a big threat to the nuclear global order, or the current biggest threat to the nuclear global order?
So I would say that Putin's war in Ukraine is a threat to the global nuclear order, but it's not specifically Putin in the war in Ukraine. I think that the biggest threat to the global nuclear order that we will see is the return of great power competition. And that is great power competition between the United States, Russia, and China. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine with the NATO response so far, and with what Russia has done, is indicative of essentially great power competition at this point. And if you think about what great power competition means for the global nuclear order, it means further dependence on nuclear weapons, which makes arms control more difficult. It makes disarmament even less likely. And at the same time, it may motivate other states to pursue nuclear weapons to defend themselves. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you would like. But I wouldn't say that what Putin is doing is uniquely the biggest threat to the global nuclear order, but his behavior is indicative of a sort of action by great powers that I think is the biggest threat to the global nuclear order.
And just to circle back, I mean, maybe to the first question and also this question, you've mentioned, how of course the war and the policies pertaining to the war have perhaps increased the potential for nuclear confrontation. Do you think this is largely a top-down, one-man sort of threat from Putin, or do you think this is really indicative of the regime entirely? Because I know Mr. Lavrov has repeatedly sort of tried to play off these allegations of threats and denounce them to an extent. Do you think it really is just one man talking, or do you think it's something that is representative of the entire regime?
So, my personal view, given leakers, given other things that we know, is I think that it is Putin and his cadre of close foreign policy advisors, many of them who are supportive of making these types of threats. But at the same time, in the nuclear age, where nuclear command and control depends upon a strong executive being able to launch nuclear weapons, I think in some respects, it doesn't really matter whether it's one man and his advisors or the regime as a whole, because there are few checks and balances on the ability to launch nuclear weapons. So I think it remains a threat regardless. It would be interesting to think about, if there were another leader besides Putin, would there still be these types of nuclear threats? But one of the other things too that we can talk about later, is in the article that if you're interested in thinking about, is that nuclear threats happen on almost a day-to-day basis without being stated. Relationships of global nuclear deterrence are premised upon threats. So the types of deterrent threats that Putin is making is just essentially vocalizing an infrastructure which already exists in the nuclear age.
And with regards to sort of these threats and how they affect society and the global order, do you think that Putin himself, or perhaps his cabinet or the regime, may actually have any regard for the global order, or do you think they're just playing with it, or is there perhaps some consideration for world safety and the way the norms and values with which we maintain that safety?
So I think that they do have certainly an interest in maintaining the global nuclear order, despite the actions that we've seen from them. And so let's break it down a little bit and think about, what are the kind of individual components of global nuclear order? So the first one, right, is nuclear deterrence between countries predicated upon the ideas of mutual threats, believing that that will, on some level, ensure international stability and stop nuclear war. As I mentioned before, Putin and his regime are making nuclear threats in order to stop, I believe, a war, right, with NATO. They want to deter it. They want to deter intervention and stop a great power war. Now, I'm not saying their nuclear threats over Ukraine are good, because they've used these nuclear deterrent threats as a shield to invade Ukraine, but I do believe they have respect for the idea of nuclear deterrence. Now, the second part of the global nuclear order that I would say is non-proliferation. And this is interesting because there are multiple ways of reading the consequences of what Putin has done in Russia. Because Ukraine, of course, had nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union, and it gave back those nuclear weapons in exchange for pledges of security that it received in the Budapest Memorandum from the United States, UK, and Russia, and now it's been invaded. So on the one hand, there are countries who may see what Ukraine went through, and they may be interested in developing their own nuclear weapons for deterrence to avoid a Russian type of invasion. But on the other hand, there are a great deal of countries that have become interested in disarmament because of the risk of nuclear confrontation they see from the war in Ukraine. And particularly many of them are from the global south, and they're interested in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Now, I think as far as non-proliferation, even though Russia's actions may be doing this, I think that Russia is still very interested in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and maintaining it. It's in Russia's advantage to keep the nuclear club very small, and I don't see really any evidence that Russia is, really contributing to proliferation among other states or encouraging it. I think the biggest threats to the non-proliferation regime right now are probably arms control, right? Arms control between the United States and Russia only exist at the level of the New START treaty, which is going to expire in 2026. And it seems unlikely that there will be a follow-on anytime soon. And disarmament, with these great powers reaffirming the need for nuclear weapons in their security. And also the Biden administration in its recent nuclear posture review, essentially saying that it relies on nuclear weapons. So to kind of really circle back, I think that what Putin is doing so far, I think there's no reason to believe that Putin is interested in overturning the idea of nuclear deterrence or having proliferation cascades. But Putin's actions have certainly, I believe, done things to threaten disarmament and to threaten arms control. So it's interesting. And I think that Putin, I don't know if Putin is interested in overturning the global nuclear order. And I think there are good reasons that the global nuclear order actually benefits the Russian Federation. But again, there are some things that Putin is doing that are deeply detrimental to the order as we know it and are really unsettling.
So it's sort of pushing the order to an extent that he'll be able to get what he wants, but he won't damage it in a way that will harm his interests, I suppose.
Yes, I think that that's true. And, one of the things that I think that the global nuclear order is very robust. And when you read articles about the NPT, for example, the NPT was negotiated in 1968 and entered into force in 1970. And if you read what some scholars and analysts say, they've been saying that the NPT will collapse for 52 or 53 years now, right? Every year the NPT is going to collapse. And so the idea is, I believe, is that the global nuclear order is very robust. These institutions that exist to ultimately stop the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that in many respects, Putin is testing its limits and showing us what its limits are. But I don't see any indication that Putin's activities are going to cause proliferation cascades and lead to mass nuclear war anytime soon. I hope not. And we can't rule these things out, particularly the risk of nuclear weapons and nuclear use. But yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about, obviously, Putin disregarding the rules, even though it may not always be in his complete interest. Do you think that early on in the war, the attacks on civilian nuclear facilities such as Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, do you think these might indicate any, like, maybe sort of pushing the bubble to try and use nuclear weapons, indicate that they might be more comfortable using them, or this is a sort of a first step? Yeah.
So no, I don't think that. I think that what we've seen the Russian Federation do, both at Chernobyl and particularly at Zaporozhye, is terrifying, and it is in violation of Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention of 1977, which talks about not having attacks on civilian facilities. And I think it's pretty firmly embedded in customary international law. And the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors in both 1990 and 2009 said that attacks on civilian nuclear facilities constituted violations of the UN Charter. So there are definitely questions here about this being a violation of humanitarian law. But I think what's important to recognize is that in many countries of the world, nuclear energy represents just a small portion of the energy mix. France, for example, is an exception from that. But in many countries, nuclear energy is 3%, 8%, or something like that. At its peak, Ukraine's getting about half of its energy from its nuclear power plants. And the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and running at full capacity, it can provide 20% of the electricity that Ukraine needs to power the country. So by Russia, I believe, carrying out these types of wanton attacks and making sure that Zaporozhye is disconnected to the power grid and taking it over, what they're doing, in my view, is making life more difficult for the average Ukrainian.
Okay.
So they're making things, there's a potential that people are going to be cold in the winter and they're going to suffer as a result. But what I do think is that I believe they've been careless. I believe they've violated international humanitarian law, but I don't see a direct connection between the risky behavior that Russia has undertaken at civilian nuclear plants and their willingness to use nuclear weapons.
Okay. But even if they were to conduct an attack that would create a nuclear sort of nuclear damage, because these power plants can, if attacked in the wrong way, could create a large scale damage. Do you think that is a goal, or is it really just to dampen the humanitarian aspect?
I mean, I don't think the humanitarian aspect is the goal, but I think what Russia has done, so humanitarian aspect as far as like making it difficult for the people in Ukraine. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the goal. And I think Russia has thought about this in such a way that they can take over those power plants, they can engage in risky behavior, and it becomes difficult for Ukraine and the international community to think about taking those power plants back because they will risk an accident. So it's kind of another type of deterrence. Now, granted, if there were to be a legitimate attack or serious accident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the risk of an accident could be quite a bit larger than Chernobyl. And in my view, if something bad were to happen there, I think that it could be substantially worse than the actual use of nuclear weapons, particularly worse than the use of tactical nuclear weapons as far as emissions and radioactive discharge.
Okay. You did mention earlier the START Treaty and how it may not continue. You also wrote in your article that the Ukraine conflict has virtually frozen all diplomacy between Washington and Moscow. So with the START Treaty expiring, I think, in 2026, how would you anticipate nuclear bilateral negotiations between the US and Russia? Do you think they will renew? Do you think they'll just rely on satellite imagery for the rest of the next 10 years? Or, yeah.
Well, arms control was in a lot of trouble before the conflict in Ukraine started. The Trump administration withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, citing Russian violations that I believe were indeed legitimate violations. It also withdrew from the Open Skies Surveillance Treaty with Russia, which led Russia to withdraw as well, too. And so as a result of that, I think arms control was in trouble. And New START is the only nuclear arms control treaty ensuring a cap on the nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States that have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So it's really important. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia temporarily canceled inspections of the treaty, on-site inspections. Now, there's enough that can be done with national technical means and satellites, telemetry, and other things to make sure that those weapons are still being kept below the minimum. They're really large. They're easy to detect. But at the same time, this was scary on some level. And then Russia, at another point in the conflict, totally discontinued the inspections, canceled them. So the inspections regime is no longer being observed in the New START treaty, which is potentially problematic. And what is scary is that New START can't be renewed anymore. It's already been renewed once after 2026, so there would need to be a follow-on treaty. And I think the current state of affairs and the political relationship between the United States and Russia, in large part because of the Ukraine conflict, makes it very difficult for those types of negotiations to happen. But in the article, my colleague Alexander Bolfrost and I write that we have actually a little bit of hope. And that is that we've seen in the past that nuclear arms control has been held hostage to the whims of political conflicts. And those include, for example, the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Like, these are things that resulted in nuclear arms control disappearing over time. But both sides were able to come together in the past and reconstitute nuclear arms control as a confidence building measure and to rebuild relationships. So I think one of the things that's possible is if there's eventually a peace treaty, a negotiated settlement, or some sort of settlement over Ukraine, if it involves the United States, I fully anticipate, given Putin's nuclear threats, that nuclear weapons will be part of the settlement. And if that happens, then there could be a return to arms control. Then the difficulty becomes the domestic politics of nuclear arms control. And it's very difficult to imagine a treaty getting through the U.S. Senate, which for a long time now, Republicans seem to have been anti-strategic nuclear arms control. So we shall see what happens. There are non-treaty options for pursuing that. So for now, what I would say is there's an urgent need for nuclear arms control. And I would call the conflict in Ukraine a setback, but that doesn't mean that arms control is dead. And that doesn't mean that the conflict in Ukraine couldn't lead to further nuclear arms control, given the nuclear salience of what Putin's doing.
And I think before we started this interview, we had a few discussions about the questions I was going to ask. And you mentioned that you may not believe that this war has damaged severely, at least the nuclear taboo. So I think there's two sides to this coin. Obviously, the renewed public awareness might encourage more people to be diligent about nuclear weapons and take steps against them. But then again, also, I think at least I've noticed that people are maybe a bit more comfortable having nuclear weapons as well now for self-defense, especially if you're British or French or if you're European, even under the NATO umbrella. So do you think the taboo has been damaged? And if not, why?
So I think it's important to identify what the nuclear taboo is. And the nuclear taboo is identified in literature about being about the kind of moral revulsion and unacceptability of the use of nuclear weapons, which is why we haven't seen any uses of nuclear weapons, I believe, in large part since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And so, yes, Putin has made a number of nuclear threats in a fairly short time span. German researchers who have kept track of Putin's nuclear rhetoric have been able to identify perhaps dozens of things that may constitute as ambiguous or clear nuclear threats during the year 2022. And that's a lot. But there are databases that people keep of nuclear threats over time. And they find that there's been, at least before 2022, 80, 90, 100 nuclear threats or more. We've seen nuclear threats before in the Suez crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Trump and Kim reacting to each other on Twitter saying, Trump saying that his nuclear button is bigger and things of this nature. And that is, nuclear deterrence at its core is a relationship that works based on mutual understandings. And if you want to deter an adversary, you need to make nuclear threats, and you need to be clear about your nuclear threats, or you need to, Thomas Schelling, the threat that leaves something to chance. And so if you're not making nuclear threats, or there aren't at least implicit threats that are understood, then there's no way that you can deter an adversary from taking actions. So even when nuclear threats aren't vocalized out loud, they're still made. Like, there's an understanding based on NATO Article 5 that there are certain things that Russia can't do vis-a-vis NATO members. And those are implicit deterrent threats. So my argument is that what Putin has been doing in the war in Ukraine is taking these types of nuclear threats that already existed and making them more prominent, showing them to the public. I believe that the use of nuclear weapons, the potential risk, has increased in 2022 and 2023, but I don't believe that there's significant damage to the nuclear taboo and that we are at imminent risk of nuclear weapons. I do think, though, as you pointed out, there's damage to the idea of disarmament. And I think it's very unlikely that France or Britain or the United States or China or Russia or even India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, I think it's going to be much more difficult for anyone to get rid of nuclear weapons, because great power competition and deterrence relationships mean that you need to have nuclear weapons in order to make nuclear threats. Does this mean that the risk of nuclear use is uniquely higher? This year it's higher, but do I think there's a substantial damage to the nuclear taboo and we're going to see nukes flying around everywhere? No. However, I think this world that we live in of nuclear deterrence and nuclear targeting, where every major city in NATO Europe is 20 to 30 minutes away from being destroyed. Every city in Russia, the United States, China is half an hour away from being destroyed or so. I think that this bears implicit risk, and it bears a greater conversation about, is this desirable? Is this the world that people want to live in, or do they prefer nuclear disarmament? And proponents of nuclear deterrence and the nuclear revolution will tell you that nuclear disarmament is dangerous, and that you'll have massive conventional wars killing millions of people, and Ukraine is just the start of it if there weren't nuclear disarmament. I take a different tack, but I think at the same time, I think it's worth having these conversations and thinking about them, because what Putin has done is reminded us of the world that we live in. And do we want to live in that world, or do we not? Do we think that that's riskier than a disarmed world? Or do we not? And so it will be very interesting to see what happens in future years as a result of this, as far as, public salience of nuclear weapons. And do publics want nuclear disarmament? What does this mean for the nuclear ban treaty? What does it mean for countries relying on nuclear weapons? And so it's a lot of things remain unseen and unknown at this point, I would say.
And if you were to localize the taboo to maybe Russia and look at the other aspects other than deterrence, do you think there it might be severely damaged? Because if you look at maybe the media there, you can see very dangerous rhetoric regarding the use of nuclear weapons. I remember seeing a small animation on Russia One, the main news channel, saying that they were going to sink the United Kingdom with a Sarmat missile. Do you think this rhetoric may impact the taboo in Russia specifically, and that the Russian people may now have a much lesser regard for the use of a more whimsical regard for the use of nuclear weapons?
So what's really interesting is that your Professor Smetana, carried out a study on Russian public opinion on nuclear weapons before the conflict in Ukraine happened. And I think it will be very difficult to carry out a study now in Russia asking these types of sensitive questions, particularly from the outside. But it would be fascinating to do that same experimental study in Russia and measure the results against each other and see if that has indeed happened. And so whether or not the Russian public is interested in using nuclear weapons, it bears a question about, if it's more acceptable and more palatable for the Russian public to use nuclear weapons, does that empower Putin at all? Is Putin mad? Will Putin use nuclear weapons? And the quote from Putin in early December is that the threat of nuclear use is rising, but we are not mad. We will not use nuclear weapons first. I don't know whether or not that's true. I'd like to believe that that's true. I'd like to believe that a lot of the relationships and understandings that we have of nuclear deterrence hold through and will continue. But, at the same time, we just don't know. The idea of nuclear deterrence was created in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and a little bit of the 70s in scholarship. And what's really interesting is that scholarship on key concepts of nuclear deterrence, it's maybe most of it was developed during a 20 to 25 year period, and it hasn't evolved that much in thinking today. And so it's an interesting question now because nuclear deterrence scholarship dealt with US and Soviet bilateral relations, where there were clear understandings that they would play by the rules of the game. What do we see today? Today, we see 9 nuclear armed states instead of 2. So we have 7 more types, 7 more actors. We don't know if everyone in China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, Israel, even France, Britain, heaven forbid, thinks about nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence in the same way as those policymakers in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. There are also new security triangles. Nuclear deterrence today isn't just a bilateral game anymore. There are security triangles between, for example, the United States, China, and Russia. And there are new technologies, emerging technologies, hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, which can help with targeting, things like that, improvements in ballistic missile defense. And what do these things mean as far as nuclear deterrence? Can nuclear deterrence hold firm and remain stable in the long run? I'm not sure. I think that there needs to be some assessment of that. And these are just some of the questions that I think that scholars were really interested in for a long time before the war in Ukraine. And I think now policymakers are starting to get a grasp of some of them. And I think the public, as Alex and I said in our article, are waking up to harsh nuclear realities that existed for a long time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. If you have any final thoughts, yeah. But
I mean, I don't have, any real final thoughts, just to say that that I think, again, as I mentioned, it will be interesting to see how things play out. But B, when you started the podcast, you addressed your fellow students. And just generally, I'm delighted to hear that there are students around the world who continue to be interested in studying these topics because they're important and they're not going away. In the United States, my parents and my grandparents participated in, duck and cover drills back during the Cold War, getting themselves under desk and having these practices. And at the end of the day, those things were about convincing the public, I think, that it could win a nuclear war and that, having nuclear weapons was an okay thing and that it was survivable. But we now know, of course, that ducking under a desk, putting a bag over your head, this type of stuff is nonsense. It will not protect you from the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that a lot of people in the world, particularly after the end of the Cold War, stopped thinking about these issues, started thinking nuclear weapons are so distant from my life and they have nothing to do with it. And it's just not something in the social media age, in the commercial age, the digital age that people really think about. And I think what Putin has done has woken people up to, as I mentioned again, nuclear realities that have existed for a long time and have outlived the Cold War. So you and your fellow students, I think, are seeing a really interesting time where these issues are only going to become more important. There are going to be more jobs that are going to be available in countries associated with arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, but also with nuclear deterrence and the maintenance of nuclear weapons. So it's a really exciting time to be studying nuclear issues, although perhaps it's exciting for all of the wrong reasons.
Fair enough. And I'll just say for anybody watching, you've mentioned your article a few times, and I've also probably talked about it in part 1. So the name of the article is The War in Ukraine and the Global Nuclear Order, and there will be a link available, so you can go check that out to know more about what Dr. Herzog has been talking with us today about. So thank you very much for your time. And
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks for having me.